Hello everyone. Tonight, I invite you to explore with me three different kinds of craft that began thousands of years ago and accompanied mankind since then. They are still around us, in our homes, objects that we use every day, and they still are, used as a means of artistic expression. So I'll tell you about ceramic, furniture making, and textile. And for each of them, we will relive their invention, the forms they took around the world and through history, from the Neolithic to our time. There's a lot to discover, but for now, all you need to do is adopt a comfortable position and listen. You can close your eyes at any time and fall asleep. In the pinned comment under this video, there are timestamps to come back, as well as links to Spotify and other streaming sites if you prefer to listen there. And there's also a link to Patreon if you feel like supporting this channel and getting the various perks that patrons receive. As always, the only sponsors to my videos are my patrons. So once again, I thank them for their support, which is very much appreciated. And now, let's begin. To better illustrate how artisanal ceramics are made, the ideal is to visit a workshop, and that's just what I did for this video, so let's go. We are in Santiago, Chile, at the facility of Paz Vial, a decorator and ceramic creator, and she was kind enough to show me around. So, how to create and reproduce all these objects? It all begins with the first one, the original, which is sculpted and polished by hand with clay. And once it is ready, its shape, its print, is taken in plaster, a matrix made with plaster. It is like a negative version of the item. This matrix serves as the model for molds, casts, that will be used to make many more. Typically, the molds can be opened, and there is an opening to fill them with clay on top. The material used here needs to be liquid enough to completely fill in the mold. So it is mixed with water to give it the consistency of melted chocolate or milk cream. Then it takes a few hours for the raw material to dry enough. It doesn't really evaporate by the small opening on top. It is more that water is mainly absorbed by the plaster of the mold. When the mold is opened, a piece has taken shape. It is still very soft and needs to be left to dry for several days. Flat pieces, like plates or ashtrays, can be molded at once in one piece. But for containers like a vase, it takes two pieces that are assembled while clay is still soft and wet. Now these plaster molds can be used a few dozen times only, and they need to be remade regularly, because they get damaged a little bit every time they serve, especially for pieces with more intricate detail. They absorb water each time and have to dry between uses. And because they are made of plaster, they dissolve a little bit. Before pieces are fully dry, the bits that need to be removed are. And a few days later, when they are almost ready, they are polished to look impeccable before the next step, which is going to be painting. Paint, or the coating of the ceramic, has to be applied evenly on the pieces, and this is obviously not regular paint. We'll talk later about the coatings of ceramic, why they are very useful, and also the art that appeared around it long ago. Once paint has been applied, the time for transformation has come, the miracle of firing. Items are placed in large ovens. They are called kilns. One can accommodate dozens of pieces here, depending on their size. These ones are electrical, and the temperature inside rises in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius for several hours. For comparison, a kitchen oven can heat up to about 300 degrees, maybe a bit more, but here this is 3 times more, and the temperatures reached in these kilns would make many metals melt. Lead, for example, melts at just 330 degrees, zinc at 420. This is seriously hot. The firing is essentially about transforming the pieces thanks to chemical reactions. They become stronger, waterproof thanks to their coating, and the layer of paint also turns shiny. The pieces are then ready with their new properties, including a remarkable stability. Organic matter like wood may decay, metals can rust. Ceramics stay exactly the same. They are somewhat fragile, but otherwise they will still look as new in centuries. This process has been perfectioned over several millennia. There are variants to it. There are also different types of ceramics that we'll talk about. But these bases were laid long before metallurgy appeared. They spread or were invented in multiple places around the world. And this is exactly the long story we are going to explore tonight. How did it all begin? The oldest known ceramic artifacts are almost 30,000 years old. Long before the first sedentary communities living on agriculture appeared. This corresponds to the late Paleolithic, and it is contemporary to the painting, the ornamentation of a lot of prehistoric caves. It tells us that ceramic was used before there were permanent villages with craftsmen practicing metallurgy, for example, or more advanced forms of pottery with a wheel. The discovery that clay and other minerals could be fired and transformed to become harder and acquire new properties. This is one of the first innovations of mankind. I'll tell you later about the various materials and the chemical reactions that happen during firing. But the first known items were not yet plates or jars. They were figurines made by hand and fired at several hundred degrees, probably in basic ovens, basic kilns, dug in the ground. The oldest examples of this were discovered in Central Europe, especially a statuette of a woman named the Venus of Viestonice. It was found in a prehistoric settlement in what is now the Czech Republic. Maybe there was a religious meaning associated with it, or it was a lucky charm, but prehistoric men from the region also produced hundreds of figurines representing animals of the Ice Age. Like I told you in the story about cave art, I'll put the link in the description, about ancient prehistoric paintings. The representation of animals, the appropriation of their image, was probably very meaningful, very important to these human communities. These figurines were probably not just toys or decorative objects. Now the oldest examples we have are from Central Europe, because well-preserved sites were found there. But it is likely that this discovery of early ceramic happened in multiple places around the world, or traveled easily, because 20 to 30,000 years ago, fire had been domesticated and clay was abundant around many human communities. Maybe prehistoric men just observed that earth or sand around and under their fires seemed to change appearance and texture after having been heated for a while. And they had the idea of trying this intentionally. We don't know exactly, but between these first figurines and the first examples of actual pottery, many generations passed, at least 10,000 years, based on archaeological discoveries. But what is the difference between ceramic, pottery, terracotta, earthenware, or other terms like porcelain? It depends on the context. Technically, a pottery is an object, often a vessel, but it can be a decorative object too, formed with a ceramic material and fired at high temperature to make it harder and more durable. So in that sense, earthenware or porcelain are part of pottery. And they are also ceramic, which is a broader term that refers to any mineral material that has been fired to modify its properties. So a brick or a tile, for example, is a ceramic, but it is not considered pottery because it is a building material and not an object that serves on its own. Now that would be a general definition of pottery, because when it comes to archaeology, pottery in this context only means vessels. And this is how we understand pottery as soon as it is about remains found on prehistoric or antique sites. In that same context, figurines are more often called terracottas, which literally means baked earth. It's the same material, same firing process. This is just a distinction based on destination that archaeologists make. And then another important distinction is between earthenware, stoneware, or porcelain, which are different types of clay-based pottery. Porcelain is a type of ceramic that was invented in China long after the two others. We'll come back to this extensively later. And it had revolutionary properties at the time. Porcelain is like the most advanced and technical material when it comes to pottery vessels. It requires very specific clay material and a high firing temperature. Before it, there was earthenware and stoneware. Earthenware was probably the oldest type of pottery. It is fired below 1200 degrees Celsius, that's 2200 Fahrenheit. It is also sometimes called terracotta, and it is non-vitreous, meaning that it absorbs liquid such as water. It is still very present in our homes, except it generally doesn't absorb water because it is coated with a ceramic glaze. This is the process from the workshop I showed you at the beginning. The objects they made are waterproof, but not thanks to the ceramic material itself. It is thanks to the coating that is applied to it before firing. Then appeared stoneware, which is a broad category for pottery fired at higher temperatures and with a more specific formula. The main difference with earthenware is that due to the higher temperature and the different material, stoneware is non-porous and it is often vitrified, that is to say, turned into a sort of glass. This basically means that, contrary to earthenware, it does not soak up liquids. This was an interesting property that made stoneware successful for utilitarian wares and higher quality products. And here again, China was a precursor. The first stoneware artifacts appeared either in India, in the Indus Valley, or in China. But in China and also in Japan, they became rather abundant. Stoneware began to be produced in Europe much later, during the Middle Ages. And then came porcelain, another Chinese invention that the Europeans were eager to imitate until they broke the code and found the formula in the 18th century. That was just a quick tangent about definitions. Now let's go back to history. So, I told you that the first examples of pottery, in the sense of vessels, appeared about 20,000 years ago, and the earliest fragments were found in China. It is believed that from China the use of pottery spread to Japan and the Russian Far East, because shards of ceramic artifacts were found in these regions, and they date from the following millennia. Did it then spread to the rest of the world, or was it invented in multiple places? We don't exactly know, but during the Neolithic, the making of pottery vessels was present on all continents. There are traces in Europe and in Africa, south of the Sahara, in the 10th millennium BC, and slightly later in America. Everywhere around the world, pottery became relatively common 10,000 years ago. It was cheap to produce, at least in comparison with precious artifacts, and it is probably the first type of wares that was made in larger facilities. We are not talking about industrialization yet, but as soon as the antiquity, there were production centers that rationalized its production, divided tasks, and produced vessels not only for local consumption, but for an entire region or sometimes for trade. This appeared in China, in India, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, in South America, and it is quite unique because it seems the same didn't happen on such a scale for other products like textiles, for example. For thousands of years, objects were formed either manually or maybe using molds until the wheel was invented. It is believed the wheel was invented first in Mesopotamia, and together with the first wheeled vehicles, the first potter's wheels appeared somewhere in Mesopotamia in the 5th millennium BC. And this helped to create curved pottery that was smoother, more regular, and probably much faster to produce, which made potters more productive. Another important element is that potteries were decorated. They quickly became support for decorative or artistic expression. This brings a wealth of information about antique civilizations. Fragments of pottery can be dated using carbon dating, which helps a lot to know not only when they were made, but what period an entire layer or an archaeological site belongs to. Their decoration also tells us of the tools that were used, the styles, the techniques. They reveal a lot more than the fragments themselves. And pottery was also traded, so it tells us of the connections between cultures that could sometimes live thousands of miles apart. For example, an early people that spread across much of Europe is named after its use of pottery, the corded ware culture. They are called corded ware culture because they had a specific way of decorating their pottery. They wrapped it with rope while it was still wet, so this left a decorative pattern. And then they fired their pottery, the rope burned off, and the patterns stayed on the ceramic. The corded ware culture spread across Europe about 5,000 years ago, in the late Neolithic, and it ended in the early Bronze Age, several centuries later. But the extent of its presence and the period could entirely be mapped thanks to the dating and specific aspect of their pottery. The use of pottery vessels spread in the Neolithic, and so did tiles and even more bricks. In regions that had few wood for construction, like Egypt, bricks were widely used for buildings. Stones was too expensive and slow to use for building, so it was reserved to tombs like pyramids or for temples, which are the Egyptian monuments that have crossed the centuries. But ancient Egypt was essentially built with bricks, often just dried in the sun, so in that sense they were not really ceramics, until they realized that bricks could become much harder and durable if fired in a kiln. So what is a kiln exactly? It is a term for a type of oven, a chamber that is thermally insulated. It can concentrate heat and can be used for the firing of ceramic because it reaches temperatures that are much higher than the one the basic oven for cooking could ever reach. The antique version, at least at the start, was quite rudimentary. They basically just were holes dug in the ground. But across the centuries, kilns were perfected, and they became more and more efficient, reaching peaks of temperature in ancient China and to a lesser extent in Greece and the Roman Empire. So, speaking of this, let's take a look at the art of pottery in various ancient civilizations, starting with Egypt, because it's always good to speak about ancient Egypt. We know about how Egyptians made pottery mainly from depictions on the walls of tombs and temples. Along the many centuries of Egyptian history, more techniques to form vessels and other objects appeared, but they all remained in use until the end. At the start, objects from the first centuries were just hand-shaped. But the problem when they are hand-shaped is that they tend to have quite thick walls. And you cannot really make large objects like that with wet clay, because they can collapse on themselves because of the weight before firing. So, over time, new approaches were invented. One that was used for large items such as tubs was to make flat and relatively thin rectangular pieces of wet clay and then weave them together before firing. This is recognizable on archaeological sites because when broken, these items tend to form rectangular shards. They broke up where they were the weakest. The potter's wheel was introduced in the 3rd millennium BC, either copied from Mesopotamia or reinvented locally. The first potter's wheels were slow. The potter would make them turn with one hand and form objects with the other hand. As I said before, it not only facilitated the making of symmetrical and almost perfectly curved objects, it was also much faster, and pottery could be somewhat standardized thanks to them. So like in other cultures, it came with a kind of mass production. Egyptians also used molds, especially to make the bread pans in which small conical breads were baked. These molds were probably just a cone of wood shaped like these breads, and they added clay around it before letting it dry and then fire the pottery. Later, in the 2nd millennium BC, during the New Kingdom, the last period of Egyptian unity and independence in the antiquity, before the country was invaded multiple times. So during the New Kingdom, faster potter wheels were introduced. They were no longer put in motion by hand, but by the potter's feet. This made the forming of vessels even more productive. So in Egypt, pottery was widespread and part of everyone's life, even poor people. They had cups, bowls and plates, and often figurines of animals and gods. Before clay was completely dry, a bit of decoration was added even on cheap pieces. It could be with a few incisions or stamps. Then it was left to dry for a good time. Like others, the Egyptians had discovered that clay pieces needed to lose almost all their water before firing, because if they didn't, water did not just evaporate in the kiln. Some of it stayed trapped inside the walls of the items, so it boiled and it could even make the piece explode. So they always need to be already dry before firing. The Egyptians had figured out that they could change the aspect of their pottery during firing too. They realized that if they let a good supply of air enter the kiln, the resulting pottery would take a red to brown color. It is because there is iron in clay. So when oxygen is abundant during firing, they tend to combine and form iron 3 oxide, also known as rust. Whereas when they rationed air and oxygen, pottery took a gray to black color, because with less oxygen available, iron 2 oxide formed instead. They didn't know how that worked chemically, but they used this process to vary their decoration and their colors. And they also discovered more and more oxides that were introduced for more colors: blue, yellow, white. There were fashions in the decorative patterns, not really fashions in the modern sense, because they typically lasted for several generations, not years like today. But most Egyptian pottery, especially luxury pieces, can be approximately dated by experts just by looking at the patterns. Heads of gods like the goddess Hathor, or Bes, a god that protected houses, lotus flowers, papyrus, grapes. Some of the pieces were found intact in tombs after thousands of years, and they are a testimony of the refinement that the Egyptians were capable of. They are exquisite and required a sum of different materials and know-how that could only be accumulated after centuries of trial and error. We know that pottery in Egypt had turned to an industrial activity in the sense that there were large workshops, and in various sites the remains of multiple kilns were found. This indicates that production went on constantly, and most of it was to be sold. But the status and the economic importance of pottery is less known. There is another civilization in which pottery had a major importance economically, and it is ancient Greece. There is an international research project about ancient ceramic that lists all known items. It is called the Corpus Vasorum Antiquorum, the corpus of ancient vases. Yes, it's a thing. It contains records of over 100,000 Greek painted vases. And when you think that most of the pottery produced in Greece was probably lost, this gives an idea of the millions and millions of pieces of Greek pottery that were made. The Greeks produced everyday pottery for kitchen use, of course, but they also developed the production of fine pottery, of luxury goods, that they exported all around the Mediterranean Sea. Not all of it was produced in Greece. Greek colonies also participated, such as in the south of Italy. The Greeks invented or used shapes that we associate with their culture. For example, the amphora. It is a type of container with a pointed bottom, and they could fit tightly against each other, which made them perfect for transport by boat. This reduced the risk of losing cargo, because once they were positioned inside the ship and tied together with a rope, they wouldn't move. They were used in vast numbers to transport not just liquid like wine, dry products too. And most of them were ceramics, even though there are a few examples of amphoras made of metal. At the time, pottery was way cheaper and accessible than copper, bronze, or later iron, of course. Another Greek container was the pitos, a larger storage container that was used for bulk storage. This one could stand on its own, on its base. More than other cultures, they also made vessels with a specific purpose. For example, for mixing, there was the crater, a large vase made to mix water and wine. The practice of drinking pure wine was very uncommon in the antiquity. It was almost always diluted with water. The Greeks had different kinds of cups, depending on the liquid they would receive. The most common type of wine-drinking cup is called the kylix. The kylix had a broad body, raised on a stem from a foot, and usually there were two handles on either side. An alternative was the kantharos, which was narrower and higher, with vertical handles. They also had more types of vases for oils, for cosmetics and perfumes. They made vases designed to serve as grave markers. And these are just a few examples of the extraordinary variety of Greek pottery. But what Greek pottery is also famous for is the ambitious figurative painting on it. In the first centuries when Greek culture emerged, the decoration of pottery was dominated by geometric patterns and a lot of circular and wavy patterns too. There were a few figurative elements, probably inspired by Crete, where the Minoan civilization was flourishing at the time, but not that many. The practice to depict characters and scenes on pottery really took off and dominated from the 7th to the 3rd centuries BC. And production of vases was dominated at the time by Athens. You know that ancient Greece was not a single state, at least not until it was unified later by Alexander the Great. It was a cultural area with a collection of small states, and the city-state of Athens was one of the most important. Athens invented the so-called red figure technique, that is to say, a black background with characters painted in shades of yellow to red. Before, characters were typically painted in black on a red background. And in production centers, vases and other vessels became a support of choice for artistic expression, in a sense similar to painting on a canvas in modern painting. And the Greeks also developed a white ground technique later, by the end of the 6th century BC. Black figures and red figures were obtained through the application and firing of thin layers of slips. Slips are mixtures of minerals diluted in water. These colors were not painted on vases after firing, they were part of the vase itself. The white ground technique was based on paint itself applied on white clay, and it was a valuable innovation because it allowed for more colors on vases, It is this mix of technical innovation and artistic value that made the Greeks dominate this trade in the Mediterranean. Their clients also knew pottery, of course, and produced their own vessels, but they just couldn't do what the Greeks were able to do in terms of technical achievement and style. And production in Athens or other cities was a true industry, perhaps the first example of an industry for consumer goods, because the production of other goods like textile or furniture was much more decentralized, whereas pottery was mass-produced to meet strong demand for elaborate luxury goods or for transport of food and beverages all around the Mediterranean Sea. As the Egyptians and later the Greeks were developing their pottery, so were pre-Columbian cultures in America, and this was also remarkable. The earliest known ceramics from the Americas were found in Brazil, in the north, near the city of Santarém on the Amazon River, and they have been dated to between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago. They were produced by a culture of fishermen and shellfish gatherers that is otherwise little known. Between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, ceramics appeared all across North, Central and South America. It is unclear whether the migrations that came from Asia brought ceramic, or if it was reinvented locally in the Americas. Maybe both happened. But in any case, pottery was present several thousand years ago from the Arctic region to the south of the continent. These cultures were often in contact with each other, but their geographical knowledge was limited to their region and its surroundings. So many different traditions formed, and potteries could look very different. In North America, the Mississippian culture that existed in the American Midwest and Southeast in the 2nd and 1st millennium BC used to temper clay with ground shell. Tempering is the practice of mixing clay with other materials. It could be ash, charcoal, sand, bone, or in that case, shell. The reason for tempering clay is that it avoids shrinkage or cracking during drying and firing of vessels. Pretty much every culture discovered this, and they developed their particular formulas. There were several other major ceramic traditions in what became the United States. The ancestral Puebloans from the southwest is another one, and the shapes and decorative patterns are all very different. But if we consider the Americas as a whole, an element that comes back more often than in other parts of the world is the production of sculpture to make ceramic objects, especially human heads or faces. They all produced vessels and all the containers they needed, but there was also a rich tradition of creating figurines, sometimes quite large, and decorating objects like urns, music instruments, and even household pottery with sculpture. Ceramic was a form of artistic expression that still exists today, of course, but it has lost the kind of preeminence it used to have in these cultures. When we think about fine art today, we are probably more inclined to think about painting or sculpture. This is a reminder that the forms of art and expression are not set in stone. It is well possible that in a few centuries, people will be surprised that Western artists of the 16th to the 21st centuries were so obsessed with painting on canvases. Let's go on because we still have more regions of the world to visit. And before we talk about China, let's make another stop in the medieval Islamic world, because it also developed an aesthetic that mixed influences from the Mediterranean world and Asia. And more than any other cultural area, they used ceramic to decorate buildings with tiles. When the expansion of Islam began in the 7th century, they inherited various ancient pottery industries in Mesopotamia, in Persia, in Egypt, in North Africa, and with them centuries-old techniques and styles. This knowledge circulated within the Islamic world for several centuries, and it was also in contact with China, which was very influential because it was not just the most advanced part of the world when it came to ceramics. We'll get to this in a minute. The Chinese had also created a variety of styles, of shapes and colors that were very appealing to foreigners. Starting with all these influences and the circulation of techniques, Islamic potters soon developed their own innovations. In the 9th century, they started producing stoneware. You remember the difference between earthenware and stoneware. It is that earthenware is porous, it is fired at lower temperatures, and it needs to be coated to become waterproof, whereas stoneware is vitreous and non-porous, but harder to make because it requires mixing ingredients precisely, and also higher firing temperatures. In Persia, lusterwares developed. These are a type of pottery with a metallic glaze that makes them iridescent. Another thing that the Islamic world would prove very good at developing was tin-glazed pottery, also known as faience, which is earthenware covered in lead glaze with added tin oxide. This gives it a white and shiny appearance. Faience was a huge success in Europe. It was imitated in Spain, in Italy, in France, and in Northern Europe. It is still produced. Historically, faience industries developed in several European cities. An important one was Delft in the Netherlands, which developed a distinctive white and blue style. Until the 18th century, this was the best Europeans could do. They knew of Chinese porcelain because pieces arrived brought by traders or as diplomatic gifts, and they couldn't help but notice that faience looked like the poor man's porcelain. Because it is typically much thicker, it has to be. Earthenware needs a minimal thickness to stay in one piece, and there is coating on both sides. So in comparison with porcelain vessel, it looks more rustic. And it can be very white and shiny, but it doesn't have the translucent property of porcelain. I'll tell you more about that when we speak about China. Returning to the Muslim world, another tradition in Islamic art and architecture that is still very visible today in Muslim countries, and that started in the 9th century, was to decorate the inside and outside of buildings with brightly colored tiling, generally arranged in geometric patterns. This was probably inspired by Byzantine mosaic at the start. The first examples were made like mosaics with many small tiles of one color that were cut and arranged to create patterns. But later, with the better knowledge of firing and oxides to obtain colors, they started to make entire panels that were painted before firing which is a much faster way of covering surfaces. The very intricate patterns on the domes and the walls, typically geometric patterns, or text or flowers or foliage, they are painted before firing, and once they are turned into ceramic, they provide at the same time ornamentation and protection because they are waterproof and very durable. Our tour would not be complete without a stop in China, because since ceramic appeared, China has been the place where most innovations have taken place. And its tradition is so rich and ancient that entire encyclopedias could be written about it. I told you at the beginning that the very first known potteries appeared in China almost 20,000 years ago, during the Paleolithic era. The Chinese invented stoneware centuries before anyone else, as far as we know, and they found out how to make porcelain almost 2,000 years before Europeans, who were the first able to make real porcelain outside China. The Chinese also used ceramic as building material for thousands of years, bricks and tiles. And when it comes to production and trade, they dominated the world market as soon as trade connections were established in the antiquity. They produced on an industrial scale that served everyone, from the popular Chinese market for kitchenware to a more discriminating Chinese market. All along the centuries, wealthier people had a knowledge and interest in ceramic in China. It was a sought-after luxury or upscale type of good. It was collected and used as decoration centuries before the same trend began in Europe, and up to the court of emperors, who had access to the finest porcelain. So what made China so advanced in this field? Probably a combination of interest in ceramics that made the Chinese invest a lot in experimenting techniques, the internal competition between artisans and dynasties, and the interest of emperors and the taste of the elite for luxury goods. The same could probably be said of silk, for example. And thanks to all this, there were a few technological breakthroughs. The Chinese made kilns that could reach higher temperatures thanks to better insulation and ventilation. Making stoneware and porcelain requires temperatures above 1200 degrees Celsius, and these were reached in China in the first millennium BC, long before other parts of the world, as far as we know. And more than in other cultures, they worked on mixing clays with all sorts of ingredients. This is probably how porcelain was invented, as one of many experiments. The one key ingredient in it is kaolin, which is a clay mineral that comprises aluminium and silicon. This is quite specific, and there can be other ingredients necessary, like quartz. Then it has to be fired at high temperature, and porcelain gets its properties, the hardness, the translucence, from a process of vitrification. Porcelain is not glass, though, even though technically glass could be considered a kind of ceramic. It is a raw material, in the case of glass, a mix of sand, soda and potash, transformed chemically by firing. But glass is generally not considered to be a type of ceramic, because the ingredients are very different, and the production process is also very different. Typically ceramics are formed and then they are fired. Glass is heated first to obtain a hot paste, and only after that objects are formed with the paste. Glass can also be melted again and transformed. It won't return to its original ingredients, but it can be recycled and made liquid again. Not ceramics. They can only be broken. Technically, it would not be impossible to liquefy ceramics at extra high temperatures and do something else with the paste obtained. But this is too complicated and not worth it. So contrary to glass, it is not recycled at all into new objects. The exact date when the fabrication process of porcelain was invented is unclear, because there were intermediate stages in the elaboration of the formula. The first proto-porcelain that was vitrified, hard and white, appeared during the Han Dynasty, in the first 3 centuries of our era. I'll put a link to the story about the Great Wall and the history of ancient China in the description if you want to know more about the context. And by the 7th century AD, the formula had been perfected and stabilized with production on an industrial scale. Porcelain was a huge success early on, and demand was very strong. To give you an idea of the scale of this production, the Chinese had developed long kilns that could be up to 60 meters long. They are called dragon kilns, and the kilns had a fairly steep slope, hence the name probably, that let hot air circulate inside. Up to 25,000 pieces could be fired at once inside one of these. The industry spread to Japan, but the Chinese protected their fabrication secrets because they got considerable income and prestige from them. Chinese porcelain began to flow into Europe in the 16th century, brought by Portuguese and then Dutch traders. And a technological race began between faience makers to try to imitate it, especially the white and blue design that remains associated with Chinese porcelain, because at the time, under the Ming dynasty, it was popular there in China. In the process, various processes were invented that are not the real thing but still represented innovations, and they are still produced today, like bone china, which was invented in England trying to replicate the Chinese formula. It contains bone ash, which is what you get when you calcinate animal bones. As the name says, it contains calcium oxide and phosphorus, and it looked better than the thick faience that was produced at the time, but it didn't have the transparency and hardness of real porcelain. Another example was soft paste porcelain. It is called soft paste because it lacks hardness, so it could be scratched rather easily. And there were many formulas for it, but they didn't come close to the Chinese one because there was no kaolin. Finally, at the beginning of the 18th century, the code was cracked in Meissen, Germany, and later in other European countries, and an European porcelain industry took off along the 18th century with success. But still the Chinese maintained a huge production and remained the mecca of porcelain, especially the city of Jiangdezhen. This is where the porcelain industry was concentrated at the time of the Ming dynasty. Ceramic in palaces and homes for decorative purpose probably reached its peak in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it is still very present in everyday life. I'm sure if you start paying attention to it in your home, you will be surprised at how many items you own in your cupboards, plates, mugs, bowls, cups, and possibly all around the house, lamps, vases, and other decorative objects. It is a different story, but in the 20th century, industrial ceramics started to be used for their properties like hardness, stability, or resistance to high temperatures. So they can be found in all sorts of devices and facilities, from semiconductors to cooktops to nuclear plants. But we have reached the end of tonight's story. There would be much more to say about ceramic, but you know where to find documentaries or books, and you can also pay a visit and support local artisans who keep this tradition alive. The sum of technique, know-how, and talent that can be behind simple objects that we see every day can be impressive. And by paying attention to this, you train yourself to go beyond appearances and realize how rich and interesting our environment can be. It is easy to see things without looking at them, looking into them, and in the process ignore all the depth and substance they enclose. So it can be ceramic and many other things, but start paying attention and ask yourself questions about these little things around you. If we take a look at the beginning of human civilization, it is hard to know exactly when the concept of furniture was invented. It is likely that early humans used natural objects like rocks or tree stumps as rudimentary pieces of furniture to sit or work. But the moment when furniture was intentionally made, that is to say, an object that supports human activities, such as sitting, working, eating, sleeping, or storing things. This is hard to know exactly when it began. It is believed that the construction or the carving of furniture began at the end of the Paleolithic or the beginning of the Neolithic, which would mean at least around 12,000 years ago. The change in lifestyle by some human communities, from a nomadic to a sedentary life, probably gave an incentive to create furniture. The need for storing things, and then the search for comfort, required new artifacts to be made. What we can be sure of is that there were at least chairs or thrones 8,000 years ago, because several figurines dated from this period show women sitting on what is obviously a man-made piece of furniture. It could have been made of rock, of wood, or bone maybe, but these first pieces were lost, or they haven't been discovered yet, because the oldest existing example of furniture that we know of is from around 5,000 years ago, and it was discovered in Skarabrae, a Neolithic village in Scotland, in Orkney Island. I made a story about it in the episode about Stonehenge. I'll put a link in the description. Skarabrae was a Neolithic site where people built stone houses with a surprising level of comfort and sophistication for the time. They had beds, dressers, shelves, cupboards, seats, all carved in stone. Stone may not be the easiest material to work with. They probably used it because there was a shortage of wood in Orkney. But because they were made of stone, these pieces have crossed thousands of years, and they were discovered almost intact. At the time when the small community of Skara lived in the north of Scotland, the ancient Egyptians had already occupied the Nile Valley, and their first dynasty, the first series of kings to reign over unified Egypt, the first dynasty ruled over an already sophisticated society 5,000 years ago. They had probably already started to make furniture several centuries earlier. But the Egyptians used light materials that were easily destroyed, or that might have been reused, and there is not much evidence of Egyptian furniture before the first dynasty. But samples, like drawings and carvings from the first dynasty, indicate an already advanced use of furnishing in houses, which is why it probably started earlier, even though direct evidence is scarce. Furniture design was one aspect of Egyptian crafts and art, and it was used throughout Egyptian society. One early seating furniture that was used from ordinary citizens up to the royal family was the stool. They were generally rectangular and made of wood, or with wood legs and a woven seat. Chairs with a back were much less common, and only wealthy, high-ranking people had some for a long time. They reached ordinary houses during the 18th dynasty in the 2nd millennium BC. The Egyptians also made tables and beds and chests for storage. There was a lack of proper wood to make furniture in Egypt, so a lot of it had to be imported from other places, especially from Phoenicia, which corresponds to Lebanon today. And when it came to high-end furniture, the Egyptians developed a decorative tradition with plenty of other materials. There was leather, gold, silver, ivory, pieces of ebony. Ebony is a precious wood. There are different species that are native to West Africa, to India and Sri Lanka, or Indonesia. It is valuable for its very high density. It is very heavy, and so heavy that it sinks in water. It is dark, and when it is polished, it gives a mirror, shiny finish, which makes it valuable as an ornamental wood. Because good wood was scarce and expensive, and also for decorative purposes, the Egyptians developed the art of veneering and marquetry. On luxury furniture, they could typically use panels of less expensive material and cover them with thin slices of better wood glued to them. This technique is very common still. It is called veneering, and a majority of mass-produced wood furniture use it nowadays. It may not have the exact feel of solid wood, but it has other advantages apart from the cost. It is more stable. Solid wood is prone to warping and splitting over time because of expansion and contraction caused by temperature or humidity. But but because the veneer is made of these layers of wood glued together, it has enough flexibility to avoid that and may stay intact for longer. Marquetry is a craft. It consists of applying pieces of veneer to a structure to form decorative patterns. It is not limited to furniture. It can be used to decorate small objects too, and not only with small wood pieces. A lot of different, generally valuable materials were used along history. It was already used in the antiquity and around the Mediterranean, and remains found in Egypt or from the site of Pompeii in Italy, the Roman city that was buried in the 1st century, show that the ancient world was already highly advanced in marquetry. Then marquetry didn't disappear completely, but it became rare throughout the Middle Ages, until a revival in the 16th century in Europe, starting in Italy, and it flourished from the 16th to the 18th centuries, with a variety of different materials like marble, semi-precious stones, mother of pearl, even tortoise shell. The use of tortoise shell became fashionable at the end of the 17th century. A lot of furniture at the Palace of Versailles at the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King, was decorated with it. Many different patterns became fashionable in high-style furniture, depending on the periods and the countries. Geometrical patterns inspired by Islamic art, foliage or floral patterns that were especially popular in France in the 17th and 18th centuries. There were also Chinese-inspired patterns, especially in English furniture from the 18th century. The most famous designer from the 18th century in England was a cabinet maker called Thomas Chippendale. He made a lot of different pieces at the time, when the late Baroque style dominated and at the beginning of the neoclassical period. I'll tell you more about these styles when I talk about French furniture in the 18th century. But Chippendale's pieces reflect the style of the time with an abundance of marquetry. They were all very high-end creations for aristocratic clients, and most surfaces are decorated with intricate marquetry panels. Returning to the ancient world, after Egypt, another civilization that left a long tradition of furniture making is Greece, and then Rome, that took most of its inspiration from Greece when it came to decorative arts. The main material used in Greece was also wood, but wooden pieces have not survived. We know of them from various sources, literature, painted vases, sculptures. Some have reached us when they were made of metal or marble. The Greeks had an extended vocabulary for furniture. For example, when it comes to seats, they had the diphros, the basic backless stool, which was common in most houses. There was also the klismos, which was a light chair with a curved backrest. Unlike Egyptian chairs that had a full back, the klismos had a smaller piece of wood, just where the back of the person needs to lean. The word throne is derived from Greek too. Thronos It was a full heavy seat designed for deities or individuals with high status. Of course, there were thrones long before Greece, but they probably proliferated at the time in the various temples and cities of ancient Greece, and could be heavily ornamented with imported materials like ebony, precious stones, or ivory. The Greeks also introduced a new type of furniture called the clinai, which is an ancestor of the sofa. It was a multi-purpose piece that could be used as a bed, as a sofa, or for reclining during meals, and it was rectangular, supported on 4 legs, with an armrest or a headboard on one side. This type of pieces is uncommon, but it still exists. They had a revival at the end of the 18th century, because a lot of inspiration was drawn from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The Greeks also produced a lot of tables. It seems they were small most of the time, because in depictions of banquets, it appears each participant had their own table rather than a larger collective one, and people reclined on a clinai to eat. The Romans produced probably more furniture than the Greeks, given the size and duration of their empire. But their furniture was heavily based on Greece, and the boundary between the two is blurred. They changed the styles in decoration, but the techniques, the materials, and the types of furniture were essentially identical. Now, if an ancient Greek or Roman was to travel in time and see the inside of our houses, they would probably be surprised by the quantity of pieces, with so many tables, high and low, seats, cupboards, shelves or rugs. And we would find a Roman house quite empty. A typical popular house in ancient Rome had just a few seats, a table, a bed, and a couple chests for storage. Even inside a wealthy home, we wouldn't find that many objects. Not really because furniture was too expensive, but because of how people lived. They didn't need a lot of bookshelves or storage space, and the decoration of luxury homes was part of the home itself. There were frescoes or mosaics on the walls, patterns on the floors, and most of the time furniture was essentially functional. It was not intended to be a central part of decoration. Now, historically there were furniture making traditions all over the world, from America to Africa to Asia. We cannot talk about everything, but it is worth taking a look at the Far East, especially China, where furniture making also started thousands of years ago. In ancient China, the interior of houses was rather sober when it came to furniture, but luxury items were also created and richly ornamented. The styles have changed a lot over time, and at some point in the 17th and 18th centuries, Chinese furniture influenced its European counterpart. Not so much the shapes, but rather the marquetry patterns or the use of materials like porcelain and lacquer. Chinese ornamentation was highly inspired by paintings including branches of trees, flowers, bamboo trees. Animals were also frequent on furniture, like lions, ducks, peacocks, butterflies, and sometimes calligraphy, like this 19th century cabinet. These were made for storage of documents or clothes. The concept of a wardrobe cabinet or a cupboard for hanging clothes vertically, this is very Western. It did not exist in China until recently. Instead, clothes were laid flat inside a chest or a cabinet like this one, like we usually do with bed linen. And for precious robes and outfits, there were horizontal racks where they would be stored individually. A lot of Chinese furniture would be painted or lacquered. In contrast, traditional Japanese furniture was more minimalist, and it exposed wood grain instead of covering it. The types of furniture are rather similar, but the Japanese also developed their own pieces, such as the tansu, which became the traditional storage cabinetry in the 18th century in Japan. Contrary to the Western tradition of using stationary furniture, tansu were generally not visible in the home, which appeared rather empty. They were kept out of sight in storage rooms, or they could be exposed in shops, and they were made also for transportation, with attached wheels or handles for carrying. Depending on the occupation of their owner, they could contain account books for merchants, medicinal herbs for apothecaries, sword blades for blade makers and polishers. And there were also smaller versions of them that served as chests on ships. Nowadays, these tansu are among the most sought-after Japanese antiques, even though they were essentially designed as functional objects, not decorative pieces. Returning to the West, with the end of Rome began a long period that includes almost all the Middle Ages, when furniture making stopped evolving. It took centuries to Europe to recover economically from the fall of the Roman Empire, and with a few local exceptions in larger cities and royal courts, the making of high-end furniture collapsed, and the types of furniture no longer diversified. There are very few pieces remaining from before the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, but based on visual documents like religious paintings or the Bayeux tapestry, we know that they looked a lot like their Roman predecessors. The Bayeux tapestry is a very long cloth embroidered in the 11th century. It depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England. It seems it was made in England, but it belonged to the Normans. It tells the story from their point of view, and shortly after its making it was sent to Normandy, where it still is. Apart from its value as a historical remain, it is remarkable for its size. It is 70 meters long. There are more objects left from the end of the Middle Ages, from the 14th and 15th centuries, and at the time, apart from seats, the other very common type of furniture was chests. Their decoration reminds of Gothic architecture and Gothic art in general. They feature many ogives and rosettes and other elements often identified with the Gothic period, such as crowns, knights with shields, fleur-de-lis, and characters from the Bible. At the same period, furniture was much more diverse and used more complex techniques in the East, in Byzantium, which had kept a lot of Roman traditions alive. But in Western and Northern Europe, the practice of veneering had decreased, and most furniture was made of solid wood. When decorated, it was more often with carved designs in the wood rather than other materials. In comparison with what would be made in the following centuries, furniture looked very rustic. Things began to accelerate again in Europe in the 16th century with the Renaissance. And since then, the appearance of new forms and the changes in styles have been constant. There were several factors behind it. First, more financial means with economic growth and the emergence of global trade. New fortunes appeared, and demand increased from all segments of the population. There was also a change in lifestyles for the aristocracy and the merchant class. Old fortresses from the Middle Ages that were cold and dark were mostly abandoned or kept only for their military value. People went to live in new chateaux and large houses with more light and a completely new interest in interior decoration for those wealthy enough to spend money on it. Until the late medieval period, most of decorative art was for religious buildings, but starting from the 16th century, secular demand for works of art, be it paintings or sculptures, for decorative gardens, and also for furniture, began to grow very strongly. And finally, starting in the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman influences. This went far beyond furniture, and it touched on all arts and architecture. But until the 19th century, all styles of furniture designs were influenced to a degree by the antiquity, be it in the shapes, the decorative patterns, or the themes of the decoration. New types of furniture appeared and reappeared too, like the ancestors of modern cabinets. At first, in the 16th century, they looked a lot like a chest put above a table. Desks also multiplied from the 17th century, and a new type of furniture for storage, the chest of drawers or the commode, was invented. There's a lot to say about the 17th and 18th centuries period, and I'm going to tell you mainly of French furniture in this period because this is what I know best. And I also have a few examples to show you. Let's not forget that during these periods, the bulk of furniture produced was actually quite cheap and simple for ordinary houses, and it was essentially functional. What we call styles of the 17th and 18th centuries was limited to a smaller production for wealthy people. But still, even though they were the minority, there were more of them than before, and over time hundreds of thousands or even millions of pieces of furniture following these styles were made, especially in France, which already had a large population at the time. And this means that these pieces are still relatively abundant and not that expensive sometimes. They cost money, and in the case of high luxury pieces made for royal courts or aristocrats, they are unaffordable to most people. They end up in museums and exclusive collections. But if you look at the category just under, they are less expensive than modern designer furniture. For example, this armchair, which is from the years 1710 to 1730. This style is called Régence, French Regency. We'll come back to what it means. This armchair is 300 years old, not the tapestry, which has been changed, but the frame, the carvings, everything. And it is typical of the type of upscale seats that were made in France at the beginning of the 18th century. I bought it 15 or 20 years ago for less than 1500 euros, if I remember well, which is money, but you can easily spend much more on an armchair made in 2020. And actually there are workshops that make copies of these old styles, and a good copy will be as expensive or even more expensive than the original. I really like this style a lot, but independently from your taste in furniture, you should always consider going to thrift stores and antique markets for furniture, including or maybe even more if you are on a tight budget. It's unrelated, but for example, I bought this little cupboard, which must be from the 19th century or early 20th century, for I can't remember exactly how much, but it was less than 50 euros. This beats even IKEA, and I'd rather have this. This used to be a cupboard to store jam. It's called a confiturier. They were very common in the south of France. In the 17th century, decorative arts and furniture across Europe evolved towards the Baroque style, which is characterized by very opulent designs, often gilded and made to impress, to be monumental. An example of this is the Louis XIV style. It corresponds to the period when the Palace of Versailles was built, and to furnish it as the impressive display of wealth and power that it was intended to be, new furniture was created with an emphasis on rich materials and abundant decoration. Louis XIV's pieces are almost always symmetrical to reinforce their monumental aspect, and to our taste, given what happened afterwards, they look rather heavy and very loaded with ornaments. Actually, furniture that was essentially monumental rather than functional was created at the time. For example, consoles, which were long and narrow tables made to be placed against a wall. They typically serve to place another ornament on top, but they are not functional, in the sense that you don't use them to sit, work, or store anything. Other new types or new forms of furniture also appeared at the time. I mentioned the chest of drawers before, which is an evolution of the ancient chest that had been popular since the antiquity. It was replaced with a column of drawers. The elevated chests of the previous century turned into armoire cabinets with generally two doors opening from the front. This period also saw the appearance of modern desks. People had been working on tables for centuries, of course, but this is the appearance of a piece dedicated to writing and working with drawers. There had been an ancestor to the modern desk earlier in the 17th century, with desks made of two columns of drawers unified by a flat surface. Under Louis XIV, they became larger, wider, and more comfortable to work. One last type that became spectacular was royal or aristocratic beds. For most people, beds were shorter than they are now, because people were not as tall in average. And in the countryside, in many provinces across Europe, beds could be closed with wooden panels to keep the warmth inside, as if people slept in a big cabinet. But at the court of Louis XIV, the bedroom became a public place. Every morning when the king woke up and got ready, it became a place of ceremony. For courtiers, it was an honor to be allowed to watch the king getting ready, and even more to help him. There was a formal awakening every day, and this lasted for decades under Louis XIV. But his successors ended this ceremonial because they didn't want the same public life as their ancestor. Following the example of the king, it became common for nobles to receive guests when they were in bed. So new extravagant beds appeared with very high canopies and 4 posts to support it. The ceiling of the bed was closed with a rectangular frame or a panel, and draperies were added all around the bed, so it could be closed at night, like a very fancy tent. At Versailles there was even a fence that separated the bed area from the rest of the bedroom, which was public, and where visitors could line up every morning for the awakening ceremony. By the last decades of the reign of Louis XIV, the style of furniture evolved towards a less grandiose and more elegant style. It was still very symmetrical and full of symbols representing power, like lion paws, faces, or suns, but pieces of furniture became less big and monumental. Also, it started to include more curves, as opposed to geometrical shapes. During the 17th century, gilt bronze also began to invade high-end furniture. The use of metal in furniture as decoration or to protect the sides from damage, this started long before, in the antiquity. But when it comes to gold, for decorative reasons, it has to be applied just on the surface, otherwise the cost would be extravagant. So there were 2 techniques for this. The oldest is with gold leaves. Gold is a ductile metal. It can be hammered into a very thin foil. Then a gold foil was caught with a pencil. It stuck to the pencil because of static electricity, and then applied to the surface, often on a coating. Here is a French console from the late 18th century, probably somewhere between 1770 and 1790, because it is a typical Louis XVI or neoclassical piece. It used to be covered in gold, and this sounds very expensive, and it had a cost, but covering a console like this only required a few grams of gold, because gold foils were really very thin. Gold has gone over time and revealed the reddish coating, and it would be possible to have it gilded again, but I'd rather not because it would look new and I prefer it with these colors. A couple other details from this piece are interesting. First, it was most probably made in Paris because it has a marble top. Maybe it is not the original top, there is no way to know, but it was made to have this kind of marble plaque on top. And the use of marble on chests of drawers or consoles was a typically Parisian technique. In the rest of France, it would have been topped with wood. Another thing is that the hidden parts are really very rough. The wood was sewed manually, and it was never polished in the parts that are not visible. And this is actually an indication that it is old and not a copy made in the 19th century or later. The first mechanical sewing machines appeared in the 19th century, and the pieces of wood sewed mechanically were much smoother. Checking that the hidden parts like the back or the surfaces under a piece of furniture are a bit irregular is a good way of knowing which period it comes from. When it comes to European furniture, you can be sure that if they are smooth or polished, it is no older than the 19th century, because people did not care at all for the invisible parts. Even in very high-end furniture, the backs that would be put against the wall were left completely rough, like for a theater set, which in a sense reception rooms at the time were. A second technique of gilding is called ormelu. It comes from French and it means literally ground gold. I'm going to show you this on my desk, which is a bit over the top maybe, but I really like it. All the decorative mountings are made of gilt bronze. This desk is an antique, but it is a copy from the years 1850s or 1860s, a copy of a desk created by a furniture maker from the first half of the 18th century, called Charles Cresson. He is identified with the style called Régence, which developed after the Louis XIV style we just talked about, and before the French Rococo style, also known as Louis XV. So it is a transition style. And this is what we have here on this desk. It still has elements of Louis XIV that I mentioned before, like the lion paws. There are faces on the sides. It is also perfectly symmetrical and a bit monumental to make a statement. But the style has also evolved with curves. If you look at the legs, floral patterns in bronze, and a sense of movement with these busts of women emerging from the leaves on each corner. It is contemporary to the armchair I showed you before, and this is also a mix of materials. It is mainly made of oak, but with a veneer and marquetry of more precious woods. There is rosewood and sandalwood. There are different metals, a lot of gilt bronze, but also iron, such as the key, and the nails everywhere. There is leather on top. The decoration on the leather was made with an iron, like a seal covered with gold foil and applied to the surface. The creator of this model, Charles Cresson, came from the creation of gilt bronze ornaments, and he was renowned for the very luxurious and expensive pieces he created, with an abundance of ormolu. Gilt bronze was obtained by taking a piece of metal, could be copper, brass, or bronze in this case, which is an alloy of relatively cheap metals. It was molded or sculpted and then covered in an amalgam of mercury and gold. Gold has the property to dissolve in mercury. And after that, the object was exposed to extreme heat in an oven, mercury vaporized, leaving only gold on the surface, and it sticks perfectly. It can no longer be removed. Gilding with gold foil does not always age well, whereas gilt bronze is very resilient. But the technique was also highly toxic because of mercury fumes, and it was prohibited in the 19th century. It has disappeared nowadays, and there are other safer ways like electroplating to gild metal without the health risk. Gilt bronze was not used only for furniture. It also served for candelabras, clocks, or decorative mountings of porcelain pieces. In the 18th century, it became a specialty of French craftsmen. Not just with gold, silver gilt was also produced with a similar technique, and it is also sometimes called vermeil. So I told you the Louis XIV style progressively evolved to a new style that dominated the middle of the 18th century, the Rococo or late Baroque style, which is known as Louis XV in France. But furniture from Italy, Germany or England, I mentioned Chippendale in England before, followed similar trends and similar taste. The characteristics of the Louis XV style are an abundance of ornaments combined with movement. There are lots of curves. Everything that was previously square or rectangular, like the top of desks or the top of chest of drawers, clocks, the legs and the backs of seats, tended to adopt curves like violins. Louis XIV's furniture was quite formal, massive and box-like. In contrast, these pieces were much lighter and designed for comfort, sometimes with asymmetrical elements. And by the middle of the period, they could include uncommon materials such as porcelain or lacquer panels imported from China. The production of these Louis XV pieces was quite massive, because it started at the royal court, but the style was emulated by aristocrats and wealthy households, not only in France. So hundreds of chateaux and mansions were furnished over time with it. Overall, in Western Europe, the 18th century was much more peaceful than the 17th. There were still wars, but they were shorter and they didn't devastate the land so much. For example, in France, no war took place on national territory until the wars of the French Revolution at the end of the century. And there was a general elevation of standards of living. The governments were struggling to fund themselves, but private fortunes flourished on trade, banking or manufactures, especially in Western Europe, in France, in England, in Germany, in Italy or in the Netherlands. The population grew too, so demand was very strong, and it was kept strong by fast changes in fashion when it came to decoration. Actually, this style ultimately went out of favor in the second half of the 18th century, but it never entirely disappeared. It kept being copied in the 19th and 20th centuries, and since then it goes in and out of favor. Apart from the aesthetics, maybe it stayed because this period, in the first half of the 18th century, is the moment when the modern concept of interior decoration appeared, with a search for furniture that at the same time is comfortable and brightens the mood and adapts to your taste. It appeared only in the aristocracy at the beginning, and it remained a reality for a very small minority for a long time. Most people acquired just what they could, and typically until the early 20th century, a household would acquire furniture once and for all. But the practice of changing decoration or making it evolve along your life, depending on your lifestyle, is something that was born 300 years ago, and since then it has gone down social classes. Weekend's furniture reflects this. The pieces are easily movable, and they can be rearranged, moved from room to room, depending on the needs and social interactions. By the years 1760, the style changed again, together with the rise of the neoclassical movement. Neoclassicism was all about a renewed fascination for the antiquity. Not that it had been forgotten before, but at the end of the 18th century, the ruins of Pompeii in Italy were discovered. Interest in archaeology surged. Travelers and artists went to sites in Greece and Italy and promoted the taste for the aesthetics of Greco-Roman buildings and art. This strongly influenced architecture, painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. Maybe there was also a taste at the time for rational thinking. This is the period of the Enlightenment. Philosophers and scientists were more influent and read than ever, and a return to something less exuberant, simpler, looked attractive when it came to decoration. All of this strongly influenced furniture making, and the new neoclassical style is called Louis XVI, because it corresponds to the reign of this king in pre-revolutionary France. The transition did not happen overnight, and a lot of pieces mixed characteristics of the new and the old styles. The Louis XVI style stabilized in the 1770s, and its main characteristics are straight lines and more simplicity than in the previous periods. But it is still very ornate. It includes a lot of elements inspired by how the antiquity was perceived at the time. Legs look like Greek or Roman columns. The symmetry is back, and there is a restraint in the use of ornaments like gilt bronze. But it also retains all the colorful and comfortable aspects of Louis XV. More than ever, people who could afford these wanted versatility and elegance rather than anything ceremonial or too heavy. Like Louis XV furniture, Louis XVI pieces were produced in large quantities, and some of the most prestigious pieces were exported across Europe. Many also ended up in the UK after the French Revolution, because large lots of royal furniture were sold by the government, as their owners had fled into exile or had been executed. Many of the buyers were British, and some of the items ended up in the British royal family or in museums like the Wallace collection in London. And then in the 19th century, many pieces migrated again to America, as several American buyers were interested, and that's why you can also see quite a lot of French 18th century pieces in American museums. Furniture in the 19th century would be hard to summarize because there were many trends coexisting, many of them based on the imitation or drawing inspiration from previous centuries. With the Industrial Revolution, demand for furniture grew dramatically, more than in any previous century, and the cost of furniture dropped with the industrialization of production. I mentioned mechanical sewing earlier, but there were many more new techniques that turned furniture from unique pieces or very small series made by craftsmen into industrialized products made in large series. When it comes to fine furniture, there were several revival movements: neo-Gothic, neo-Baroque, more neoclassical, including another style at the very beginning of the 19th century called Empire, at the time of Napoleon. This style returned to a more monumental approach, with many pieces directly inspired from ancient Roman furniture. The lion pose returned, tables or seats became a bit more massive. There was also inspiration from ancient Egypt that was also rediscovered following a military expedition to Egypt led by Napoleon in 1798. As the century advanced, furniture tended to become simpler and less ornate than in the 18th century, which again reflected the evolution of society. The leading class, the one that would influence mainstream taste with its economic power and status, was now the bourgeoisie, and its values of discretion, restraint, and good traditional morals in the 19th century during the Victorian era didn't really correspond to the exuberant style of 18th century furniture, at least in Europe. In America there were huge new fortunes appearing, and they became the main lovers and collectors of 18th century furniture that had now become antiques. With the rise of the bourgeois society, a new type of piece that didn't exist before appeared: the dining table. It has become such a basic of modern houses that it's hard to imagine that there were no dining tables nor dining rooms 200 years ago. People ate on tables that served multiple functions. There were tables in kitchens to prepare food, but no room dedicated to eating. People ate anywhere, in their bedrooms when they were alone, in living rooms or in galleries, and when there was a dinner party, basic tables were assembled with trestles and wooden boards, and a tablecloth to make the table look good. The dining room and its table are inventions from the 19th century. And by the end of it, there were new artistic movements that inspired furniture and were also a reaction to an increasingly industrialized society where products were more and more standardized, and to a perception that decorative arts were declining. An example of this is the arts and crafts movement that had its center in Great Britain but reached America and continental Europe too. It stood for traditional craftsmanship against industrialized production, and it found inspiration in old medieval or folk styles of decoration. As a movement, it was displaced in the 20th century that went towards always more modernism, new materials in furniture, and architecture too. But the concern for the preservation of ancient know-hows and crafts never entirely went away. It still exists today. A paradox with the arts and crafts movement is that it was a reaction against standardization and industrialization in the 19th century. but at the same time it strongly belongs to this period. The nostalgia for ancient times that are a little bit idealized, or the aspiration to reproduce the past, these are very much aspects of 19th century design and art. Another attempt at finding a new style at the end of the 19th century was the Art Nouveau, or modern style movement, about at the same time as the arts and crafts movement, with which it shares some elements. Art Nouveau was a reaction against the taste for historicism and against the reproduction of ancient or exotic architecture, furniture, and generally decorative arts of previous centuries. It tried to invent a new aesthetic, a modern aesthetic, inspired by natural forms, like the curves of plants and flowers. It didn't reject industrialization, quite the opposite. It adopted new materials like steel, glass, and concrete that could be given new shapes. So in this sense it was very modern, but it went out of favor at the beginning of the 20th century. And to us now it looks very dated. Actually, it created the kind of shapes and aesthetics that you sometimes see in fantasy movies. If you take the Lord of the Ring movies, the cities of the elves are directly inspired from it. Since the 20th century, multiple styles have coexisted. But the one broad movement that has dominated furniture making and that we associate with the past few decades has been modernism. There are different aesthetics, such as the Art Deco movement in the 1920s and 30s, the Bauhaus that tried to invent a new design of objects and buildings based on modern material and techniques put at the service of people's quality of life. Multiple designers since the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. This trend towards modernism continued after the Second World War, integrating even more new materials like plastics, fiberglass, laminated plywood, stainless steel. They have made designs more and more accessible financially, and also more and more global. There are schools of designs, groups of designers with different approaches in many places. In the 20th century, a lot of successful design ideas have come from Scandinavia, Italy, Japan, or America. But there are no longer styles of furniture closely associated with one culture, and many interiors have become eclectic, with a mix of modern and older styles, even when the furniture is new. When did mankind start to wear clothes? Long before textiles were invented, in fact. Research indicates that humans may have begun wearing clothing as far back as 100,000 to 500,000 years ago. Probably animal fur and skin, possibly clothing made of leaves or other vegetal material. We don't exactly know. But the most ancient sewing needles that have been discovered have been dated to at least 50,000 years ago. And we're going to see that textiles appeared tens of thousands of years later. From 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, we have figurines found in Europe that depict clothing pieces. There are skirts made of twisted fibers, hats or caps, belts. Archaeologists also found various artifacts used in textile making, like weaving sticks. The oldest of them have been dated to more than 7,000 years ago. It is unclear exactly when the transition to actual textile happened, as opposed to skins sewn together. But the first type of textile was probably felt. Felt is not a woven fabric. It is obtained by matting and pressing natural fibers together. The ancient process only works with animal hairs. Hot water is applied to layers of animal hairs, and then when the fibers are agitated and compressed, they hook together into a single piece of fabric. It doesn't work well with vegetal fibers because they don't have this property to curl and form a single piece when they are soaked in hot water and pressed. This technique probably appeared in Central Asia, and it is still used by nomadic tribes to make clothing, yurts, boots, or rugs. It is a very useful material because it is water repellent. It doesn't burn easily. It absorbs sound, and actually, even though it is not a very common type of textile, you may own some. It is used to cover pool tables, bridge tables, game tables in casinos, or as a damper in many musical instruments, like in pianos. About 8,000 years ago, woven textiles appeared around the world, and evidence of their presence can be found on every continent, at least in regions that were dry enough to preserve them. That includes the Middle East, China, India, North Africa, and dry parts of America, especially Peru. It is less certain when textiles were first made in regions around the equator or the tropics, because all textiles are relatively fragile and they survive thousands of years only in the driest regions. But it is likely that they spread all around the world during the Neolithic. We know that this period was rich in migrations that propagated innovations at a very slow pace compared with our modern standards. It took centuries or thousands of years, but this is still not that much relative to mankind's history. It seems the first fibers used in woven textiles were vegetal, and the first one was flax, also known as linen, long before cotton. Flax was cultivated at least 8,000 years ago in the Middle East. It is a crop that serves for food. The seeds are edible and give linseed oil, and the stem gives fibers that are very strong, stronger than cotton, and relatively smooth. From the Near East, the cultivation of flax spread to Europe, to India, to China, where it was present about 5,000 years ago. Flax was cultivated extensively in ancient Egypt, for example, where it was used for clothing, for sails, and to bury people as a shroud or to wrap mummies. In the entire Mediterranean world and in Europe, people relied mainly on linen for plant-based textiles. They also used a lot of wool. We'll talk about that later. But at the time, cotton was very rare in this part of the world. The Phoenicians traded Egyptian linen throughout the Mediterranean. The Romans adopted it, and several centuries later, in the European Middle Ages, it was still a very important fiber. In Europe, the industry was centered on Flanders. The crop was cultivated in Northern Europe, and then it was processed and turned into cloth, including dyed, around Flanders, and exported via medieval trade routes. If you are interested in how dyes were produced and how the taste in color evolved in this period, I made a story called History of Colors recently. I'll put a link in the description. Linen dominated vegetal fibers in the West until the 18th century, when cotton replaced it. At first, cotton and cotton fabrics mainly came from India, but as cotton products grew in popularity, the Europeans took control of this industry. Cotton was introduced to their colonies in America as a colonial crop. They imported the raw material from America and India and produced textiles in a region centered on England and the north of France. We will return to the history of cotton a little bit further down the road. There were several steps involved in the production of textile, be it with linen, cotton, or wool. They haven't changed that much, even though they have been industrialized, and they are still practiced to make fabric with natural fibers. First, the raw material has to be prepared. Fibers are washed in a first cleaning phase. Then comes carding and combing. These are methods to disentangle and straighten out the fibers. Once the raw material has been prepared, it is turned into thread or yarn by spinning. Spinning is the action of pulling and twisting the fibers. It could be done manually with a sort of spike. This is probably how it began. But during the Antiquity or the Middle Ages, it is a bit unclear. The spinning wheel was introduced, first in India and the Islamic world. From there it reached Europe and became widely used. The spinning wheel increased productivity and helped produce regular yarn, and it was fundamental in the textile industry prior to the Industrial Revolution, when it was replaced with other machines. After spinning, the yarn had to be woven, and this was made on a loom. Threads were arranged vertically from the top of the loom when it was vertical, or from one side. This was called the warp. And then the weaver passed a horizontal thread, the weft, through the vertical threads using a shuttle. To ensure that the piece of fabric remained tight, the weft thread was pushed every time it had been passed through the warp. At this point, after hours or days or even weeks of work, a piece of cloth was obtained, but there were finishing stages. For woolen cloth, there was fulling, which was the process of soaking it in water and then beat it with hammers to tighten the threads. Then dyeing, and eventually printing. Printing and dyeing were the big advantages of cotton, because this fiber works very well with color. So I told you cotton fabrics replaced linen for the most part in the West. But cotton also has a very ancient history of its own. In the ancient world, cotton was produced and used in two main centers, India and America. The oldest known cotton fabric was dated to 8,000 years ago, and it was found in Peru. It is believed that this is where the plant was first domesticated. There were also cotton textiles in North America. There is evidence that it was cultivated 5,000 years ago in Mexico and Arizona by pre-Columbian Native American peoples. The other historical region of origin of cotton, where it was probably domesticated independently from the Americas, was India. The Greeks and later the Romans knew about cotton. To them it was an imported luxury good that arrived via ancient trade routes like the Silk Road. They marveled at cotton because it was very smooth and light, and they considered it superior to wool or linen. Cotton could also fix very vivid colors, contrary to wool, and the only fabric considered even better was silk, which was another imported good. A bit of cotton cultivation happened in Egypt in the antiquity, but it never became big or replaced linen and wool. Cotton became a bit more common in Europe in the Middle Ages, but it was still relatively rare. It was introduced to Spain and Sicily in the south of Italy with the Muslim conquest. These regions were retaken later, and cotton manufacture became an industry in the north of Italy and Flanders. The raw material arrived via Venice. It was one of the products that Venetian traders brought from their travels to the Near East. They also imported a lot of ready-to-sell Indian fabrics that had transited through Persia and the rest of the Middle East. At the time, these fine Indian fabrics were considered superior to anything the European industry could make. And this domination lasted until the 18th century. India exported to China, to the Muslim world, and to Europe, even though it took time for Europeans to realize where the textiles came from. For example, there is a type of cotton fabric called muslin. Its name comes from the city of Mosul in Iraq, from where Europeans supposed it came from. In reality, muslin only transited through Iraq and came from various production centers in India. The biggest one was located in the east of India, in Bengal, around the city of Dhaka, which is the capital of Bangladesh nowadays. But there were several. The rulers of India in the 16th to 18th centuries encouraged the production of cotton and cotton textiles, and it grew a lot until the 18th century. Chinese and Muslim traders were joined by Portuguese, then Dutch, then English and French buyers, who sailed to India via the south of Africa, and over time also took charge of this trade in Asia. It is estimated that in the 18th century, Indian textiles were by far the most important manufactured good in world trade. These textiles could be found from America to Japan, and that became a problem for European trading nations because at the same time they had little to offer. India was largely self-sufficient, and European products were not in high demand. So they had to export large quantities of precious metals to pay, gold and silver, to pay for these Indian products. And this was one of the reasons that pushed European countries to try and develop their own cotton industry. They increasingly imported raw materials and developed their own printing industry with new patterns. An example of that is a type of decorating pattern called toile de Jouy that started in the 18th century. It consists of a repeated pattern on a plain background, generally white, and the pattern is in color. Traditionally, it depicts pastoral themes or an arrangement of flowers. These patterns originated in Ireland, but they became very popular in France and in the UK in the 18th century. And the production grew exponentially in these two countries. They were used a lot to cover furniture, to cover walls, or for curtains. The name, Toile de Jouy, means cloth from Jouy, which is a city near Paris. The need for always more cotton motivated the development of the crop in colonies, in the West Indies mainly, where the plant was already present before the Europeans arrived, like they had started to do with other colonial crops like sugarcane, coffee, or tobacco. They developed plantations, and cotton became one of the main colonial products in the 18th century. This had dramatic consequences in other parts of the world. The worst is that it stimulated demand even more for African slaves. In total, it had begun before, but cotton alone was responsible for the deportation of hundreds of thousands, maybe even a few millions, African people to the Caribbean and later to the United States. In the years following independence, the US were not a big cotton producer, it was even very marginal. But it took off spectacularly in the 19th century. By the middle of the 19th century, cotton-producing states like Georgia, Missouri, Louisiana, Alabama had small populations, but 50% of this population were slaves, many of them born in America from parents brought 1 or 2 generations earlier. Another consequence of Europeans and later Americans taking control of the cotton industry was the decline in India's industry. It wasn't completely ruined, but European production became cheaper and caught up in quality, which only accelerated with the Industrial Revolution. The US became a major provider of raw cotton and replaced India as the main exporter of this commodity. The two main clients were the UK and France, and during the Civil War, the Confederacy even tried to force the two countries to intervene against the North by starving them of cotton. It implemented an embargo over cotton. This is sometimes referred to as cotton diplomacy. It didn't work, but the fact that it was tried shows how important the supply of cotton and the textile industry in general had become to these countries by then. Flax and cotton were the two main vegetal fibers used in textiles, but there still is, animal fibers too, like wool and the most precious and labor-intensive of them all, silk. Let's take a look at them now. Silk is about 6,000 years old, and as you know, it originated in China during the Neolithic. For a very long time, several thousand years, silk remained confined to China until the opening of the Silk Road in the last centuries BC. But even after the Silk Road appeared and silk products reached the Near East, India, and the Mediterranean, China kept a monopoly on silk production for another millennium, because no one outside China knew how to produce it. We think of silk mainly as a luxury good nowadays, a very fine and precious kind of textile, and it always was expensive. But it was much more mainstream a few centuries ago, before the price of cotton dropped and before synthetic fibers like nylon replaced it for a fraction of the cost. As you know, silk is a thread produced by an insect, the silk moth, when its larva is a caterpillar and prepares its transformation. It produces a cocoon made of a very thin but strong thread. With this thread, very light and shimmering textiles can be woven. There is a legendary tradition in China that presents the origin of silk as an accident. A silkworm's cocoon would have fallen into the teacup of an empress. She tried to extract the cocoon from her drink and began to unroll the thread. Then she had the idea to weave it and marveled at the resulting textile. She observed the life of the silkworm and began to instruct people in the art of raising them, sericulture. This secret was kept in China until the middle of the first millennium AD. Silk was exported, but its origin remained a mystery. The Romans were confused about it. They thought the fabric was harvested from tree leaves. They knew that it came from silkworms, but they believed the caterpillars wove the cloth directly on trees, like spiders. Early on, silk provoked a real craze in Chinese high society because of its lightness, shimmering appearance, and apparent perfection, so much that it was restricted to the members of the imperial family. And this prohibition lasted for about a millennium. The right to wear silk was reserved to the emperor and a few very highly placed people as a sign of distinction. Some silks are shinier than others. The appearance is due to the structure of the threads. They have a prism-like shape that refracts light from every angle. After centuries, the right to wear silk was finally extended to a larger circle, but it remained prohibited to the masses. It was even forbidden for peasants, that is to say, the vast majority of the population, to even touch it. And this prohibition was lifted only under the Qing dynasty in the 17th century. But silk was not limited to clothing. It also served as a form of paper. Paper is another Chinese discovery. it could be made with various raw materials, with bamboo, straw, linen, and also silk. In the 2nd century BC, under the Han dynasty, the 2nd imperial dynasty in China, silk paper began to be produced, and it became the first type of luxury paper. At the same period, silk even became more than a material. It was also a bit like a currency because it was very valuable in its own right. It could be used to pay high-ranking government officials, or to reward wealthy citizens, or as a tribute. The length of silk cloth was a monetary standard in China, like the weight of gold. Silk reached other parts of the world long before the Silk Road was opened and a regular arrival of the product was put in place. The late ancient Egyptians knew it, and so did the Greeks and the Romans before the opening of the Silk Road in the 2nd century BC, because in the previous centuries, small quantities managed to leave China. But it became available in much bigger quantities with the Silk Road, and the fame of silk and its price threatened the Chinese monopoly over its production. The Chinese were very aware of this. There was an imperial decree that condemned to death anyone attempting to export silkworms or their eggs. But their monopoly was finally broken. First in 300 AD by the Japanese. An expedition could capture silkworm eggs, and 4 young Chinese girls who were forced to teach the art of sericulture to their captors. The Japanese refined their techniques, and over the following centuries, sericulture spread to a larger scale in Japan. In the West, it is believed the first successful attempt happened in the 6th century, in the Byzantine Empire. Monks managed to smuggle eggs hidden in rods of bamboo, and Byzantium was able to establish a silk industry. Slightly later, so did the Arabs, who introduced it across the shores of the Mediterranean, like they did with cotton. This didn't kill the Chinese silk industry, which had several thousand years in experience and continued to produce the highest quality silk fabrics in the following centuries. Then techniques of silk production reached the rest of Europe after the beginning of the Crusades in the Middle Ages, and a new production center appeared in the north of Italy. It was reinforced after the Fourth Crusade, during which Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was sacked, and the silk industry was ruined in Byzantium. Hundreds of skilled weavers relocated to Italy. And with the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the east, which reduced European access to imported silk or made it more expensive, Italian silk prospered. The long tradition for fine textiles in northern Italy started a really long time ago, in the Middle Ages. It was made possible by the concentration of trading cities like Venice and Genoa that imported know-how and new materials to an area that was well populated, with wealthy patrons that were a solid client base for luxury textiles and luxury goods in general. By the 15th century, Chinese silk kept reaching Europe, But at this point, more than half the production had become European, mainly Italian. Then, in the 16th century, the European center of silk moved to the other side of the Alps, to the city of Lyon in France. France was having a similar problem with the Italian city-states that Italy had had before with Indian or Chinese products arriving via the Silk Road. There was a massive trade deficit that transferred too much precious metals to Italy. So French kings tried to develop a national industry, because with its large population and higher classes that were willing to spend fortunes in luxury goods, plus the emergence of a new phenomenon called fashion. We'll come back to that later. France had become the biggest consumer of silk at the time. Of course, for centuries, most of the demand for precious imported goods had come from a small group of nobles and wealthy bourgeois. Royal courts across Europe were a big chunk of this demand for luxury goods. But in the 16th century, this reached unprecedented levels. At the courts of Henry VIII in England, Francis I in France, in wealthy Italian city-states like Venice or Florence, in Rome around the popes, in Madrid, courtiers and the high aristocracy began to spend more than ever on clothing or jewels. It was absolutely common for these people to spend several times the life income of a regular person for just one outfit that they would wear only once. It is this high demand for luxury products that made the luxury goods industry emerge in Europe, in Italy, and even more in France, because demand was very strong and constantly renewed by changes in fashion. So Lyon became the new European capital of the silk trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, because it had been granted a trade and manufacturing monopoly, and it became successful at creating new patterns and new styles that were used for high-end clothing, for tapestries or furniture. In the 17th century, there were more than 10,000 looms dedicated to silk manufacturing in Lyon, and this industry supported a third of the city's population. This was huge for pre-industrial times. When the Industrial Revolution began in the last decades of the 18th century, its main focus was textile, and many innovations were driven by the cotton industry, essentially in the UK. As we have seen before, cotton became a major commodity, but silk stayed on the side, because a lot of productivity gains in textiles were made in spinning thanks to new machines. Silk is already a thread, so it didn't benefit from it. Also, it was and remained a luxury product. When the price of cotton cloth was dropping, which made it accessible to a larger market, weaving precious silk fabrics that often incorporated silver or gold threads was a very delicate process. It was made in small quantities, and it couldn't be fully industrialized. So, as giant factories with thousands of workers were beginning to appear, silk production always remained semi-industrial. There were useful innovations, though, like the jacquard loom which was a mechanical loom with a string of punched cards that automatically wove the patterns. This loom is quite famous because it was a precursor from the 1800s to computers. The system of punched cards was a limited but effective form of programming, and actually punched cards remained in use until the 1970s in computing. But with the Industrial Revolution, European silk started to decline and never recovered. It was very labor intensive, and innovations and productivity gains could not fully compensate for the rise in costs. Instead of dropping, like the cost of raw cotton, the cost of silkworm cocoons was on the rise. And with smooth and colorful cotton products becoming much cheaper, demand for silk decreased. It became more attractive again in the 19th century to import it from China or Japan, which had also become quicker with the opening of the Suez Canal. And silk production in Italy or in Lyon became marginal. It still exists, but it is now limited to very high-end products or fabrics to restore antique objects like tapestries or seats covered in silk. So it was a counterintuitive outcome of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. But as a result of it, China became again, and by far, the biggest producer of silk in the world, which is a spot it retains to this day. We're going to talk about clothing, but before that, we have to take a look at one last very important type of fiber, wool, which also has a history of its own. I told you at the beginning that the most ancient known form of textile was felt, which was not woven but pressed and made of animal fibers. Animals produce different kinds of fibers that have a rather similar chemical composition but different structures. Wool is different from hair or fur. They all grow from specialized cells located in the skin, called follicles. But there are different types of follicles producing different types of fibers. Their diameter, their crimp, or their elasticity can vary a lot. Wool is finer than hair and fur, and this gives it a higher amount of crimp. A fine wool, like merino for example, can have up to 100 crimps per inch. In contrast, hair has none. It would be difficult to spin hair into yarn because individual fibers would not attach to each other, whereas it is easy with wool thanks to all the little crimps that make them hold together. Because of all the possible characteristics of wool, the diameter, the crimps, the content in lipids, the natural color, the percentage of fibers of different sizes in a fleece, even the different animals it can come from, because it can be sheep, but also goats. Wools like cashmere and mohair are from goats, or rabbits like Angora, or camelids, including alpacas. So there are so many variables that wool is probably the most diverse type of natural fiber. And it is also very much a product of domestication, because real wool was very rare in nature before domestication, especially the domestication of species that now produce it. Wild sheep were more hairy than woolly, and archaeological discoveries suggest that the selection of sheep for their wool began around 6000 BC, about at the time when woven textiles appeared. But maybe this wool was used more for felt or other things, because the oldest known wool garments have been dated to 2,000 or 3,000 years later. But the selection of sheep that produced more and more wool and less hair turned wool into a serious alternative to linen. At the time of the Roman Empire, the Mediterranean and European population wore essentially two types of material, linen and wool. Cotton was still a curiosity, and silk was extravagant, so these were not part of the life of the vast majority of the population. The two types of material are quite complementary. Wool has the advantage of impeding heat transfer. It is a good insulation material because wool fabrics have a greater bulk than other textiles because of the crimp. So they hold air pockets, and this is what provides thermal insulation. Linen was more adapted to warmer and drier climates, like in Egypt or big parts of the Middle East. But up to a point, when it becomes really hot, the property of wool to keep the outside heat away may be useful. And desert peoples like the Bedouins in Arabia or the Tuaregs in the Sahara used wool. They used wool clothes for insulation. Early on, the different qualities of wool were used for different products. The finest ones for clothing and the coarser ones for blankets or rugs. And every single region in the Middle East and in Europe developed a wool production from keeping herds of sheep to manufacturing clothes. And the same happened around the world with local species that would be domesticated. For example, in South America it was more with alpacas and llamas, or goats in India. The wool trade was a major part of European trade in the Middle Ages. A major part of the production was local for local consumption, especially in more remote areas. But by the 13th century, an international trade and division of labor took place. There were two main regions of weaving and trading that were the Low Countries, that is to say modern Belgium and the Netherlands, and Italy. Raw material converged from all of Western Europe to these regions, and the main producers of raw wool were England and to a lesser extent Spain. Actually, wool remained the main export of England for centuries, and its production was critical to the English economy, at least until the 17th century. And even after that, it remained protected. For example, at the end of the 17th century, the English crown forbade American colonies to trade wool with anyone but England. And because a great deal of the value of woolen textiles was in the dyeing and finishing, England tried to develop its own manufacturing industry. In the 14th century, it transformed only 10% of its wool into textiles, and this share went up over the following centuries. In many regions where there was an important wool manufacturing and trade, this particular industry had a big impact on the development of the economy and the long-term slow emergence of capitalism. Because by the end of the Middle Ages, this trade had become really serious. It generated capital that its organizers could reinvest, and it modified the organization of production in countries like England, Italy, the Netherlands, the west of Germany, the north of France. A new class of bourgeois that we could call entrepreneurs took charge of the whole production process, out of the authority of guilds or states. There were still no factories or elaborate machines at this point. This would happen centuries later. But they organized and funded the whole manufacturing process. They bought raw materials, and they gave work to a myriad of individual workers or small workshops. Some spinned wool to turn it into yarn, others wove it, others dyed. The supervisors bought and provided all raw materials, they paid by the piece, and they ensured the logistics too, delivering materials and later retiring more elaborate products. This system was called cottage industry in England, or Verlag system in Germany. In the regions where it happened, it had a lasting impact. It elevated standards of living, and it was generally well received by inhabitants from rural areas, because it gave them an additional income stream, especially in the winter when they couldn't work in the fields. It also allowed the accumulation of capital that could be invested somewhere else. Decades before the flowering of the Renaissance in Italy, this is how various families like the Medici in Florence built their fortunes in the wool trade. And they used it to create the first banks or invest in other sectors. When the Industrial Revolution began, centuries after the emergence of this proto-capitalism, it is not a coincidence that it took off first in Great Britain and then in parts of continental Europe. The ingredients necessary for this transformation were, of course, a number of technical innovations like machines and the availability of raw materials, but also this entrepreneurial capital and spirit that had appeared long before and was ready to invest in manufacturing projects for the sake of profitability. So let's not underestimate the historical importance of textile and wool specifically in shaping the economic world we live in. It was central to the process of capital accumulation and a new organization of production. It goes well beyond textile itself. In the 19th century, the production of wool to feed European industry followed the same path than cotton and many other raw materials. It was delocalized to colonies or other parts of the world. In that case to Australia, which remains the biggest wool producer in the world, New Zealand too. Other big producing countries today include China and the US. So, we made an overview of the main natural fibers that have been used for thousands of years in textiles. there are more. For example, jute, that is the plant used in textiles like burlap. But these always were the most important ones. It's interesting to know about materials, techniques, or how the textile industry contributed to shape the world. But there is yet another dimension to textile, a more psychological, social, creative one. And we're going to touch on this by taking a quick look at the history of clothing. There are two approaches to it. The first one is utilitarian. Men and women started and continued to wear clothes as protection against the climate. That's obviously a reason. But clothing also individualizes people, and may be something that defines their place in the world, in society, because it indicates their status, their gender, their degree of affluence. There is no escaping these norms. Even not caring about how we dress is a statement in itself, or will be received as one. So there are also cultural and social dimensions to clothing, and the psychological one too. Clothing protects against the climate, but also against the look of others. This is where concepts like modesty, aesthetics, appeal come into play. There are social norms, but the way individuals choose to position themselves in front of these norms is very much a personal, psychological posture, which indicates how they see themselves, consciously or not. Will they try to stand out or blend? Will they play with the norms and be a bit provocative, or observe them scrupulously? Will they pay a lot of attention to their appearance or not? And these norms change over time. A proof of the symbolic and social importance of clothing is that all societies regulate it one way or another. And actually, regulation of clothing is a good indicator of how normative a society or a political regime is. The most authoritarian regimes that pretend to control how people live and what their values should be also tend to enforce stricter clothing rules. You could see that in communist countries or in deeply religious states and communities. They tend to highly regulate clothing norms because they express how compliant individuals are. And there's nothing new about it. Ancient societies, you can take Egypt, China, the Greeks and the Romans, they all had very explicit rules about clothing that were often turned into laws. The way people are given much more leeway to play with the norms in Western societies since the 20th century without breaking the law is quite extraordinary. But it doesn't mean there are no norms. There are still rules of modesty. There is the understanding that different circumstances call for different clothing. And another characteristic of modern societies is the concept of fashion. It is hard to say precisely when fashion became a thing, because even in ancient societies there were changes in taste, and clothing evolved over time. It's a matter of speed of change and of intentionality. There is fashion when people are willing to change how people dress. In ancient societies, these changes were either very slow, very progressive, and actually so slow that they were imperceptible, or they happened suddenly after political events like invasions when various cultures and approaches to clothing mixed, or after a drastic economic or social change. People could start to dress differently to express that new times had begun. But it is true that at some point in the 14th and 15th centuries in the West, something happened. After centuries of very slow change, the way people dressed began to change much faster, and an entire industry appeared progressively around this, with clothes makers actively trying to innovate and invent new shapes, new types of clothes, with new colors or patterns. And in the following centuries, this preoccupation about clothing descended progressively from the highest spheres of society to all other classes, becoming a popular trend. This is why the emergence of Western fashion is dated to this period, 500 years ago. And it is true that unless you are an expert, it is very hard to distinguish between clothes from the 10th and the 13th centuries, whereas everyone can say when clothes are from the 18th, 19th or 20th centuries. And since the 20th century, we can even distinguish decades. That would have been unthinkable a few centuries back, when a new generation systematically dressed like the previous one. However, the human body has not changed, and there's a limited number of archetypes of clothes that can be made. These archetypes were invented thousands of years ago, and still dress everyone. A first archetype is a draped costume, when a piece of cloth is just draped around the body. This type of clothing has become very uncommon in the West. Pareos are an example, but in the antiquity, in Greece or Rome, they were frequent for men and women alike. And in some cultures they are still very present, like the Indian sari. Then a second type are pieces of cloth with a hole for the head, like a poncho. These have also become uncommon, but they were quite popular in the Middle Ages. Then there are sewn clothes, made of several pieces of cloth with sleeves, that are made to be worn either closed, like shirts or dresses. Their ancestors wear tunics, or a typical piece from ancient Greece called chiton, or they can be open like a coat. And finally, there are sheath clothes that are adjusted to fit the body, like trousers or jumpsuits. All clothes fall into these archetypes, but with the variety of materials and colors and fittings and accessories that can be added to them, possibilities are almost infinite. So let's take a look at how clothing evolved since the emergence of Western fashion. In the 15th century, as the social concern for out-of-date clothing began to exist, new pieces appeared that looked rather extravagant in comparison with previous centuries. For example, the houppeland, which was a voluminous robe with floor-length sleeves. This later went completely out of fashion, but it never disappeared entirely, in Western civilization because it became the familiar academic and legal robes of today, the ones students wear for graduation or judges when they sit. A lot of fashion and trends in the 15th century appeared at the court of Burgundy, which at the time was particularly wealthy and influent. For men, another highlight of the century was the appearance of a type of fitting jacket called doublet that was worn with hoses, which were like very fitted trousers. This fashion started in Italy and Spain and spread to the rest of Europe. At the time, and it continued through the 16th century, Spanish clothing was quite influential as Spain was on the rise. It had a sobriety that was picked up by Protestant countries in Germany, in Scandinavia and the Netherlands. Less so in England, where it remained confined to Protestant circles. By the end of the 16th century, a sharp distinction in style could be seen between Protestant fashions that showed more restraint and austerity and used a lot of black, which was an uncommon color until then, and a more revealing and colorful way of dressing in France and Italy. An item of clothing that appeared in the mid-16th century is the ruff, a sort of extravagant collar made of linen or lace. They were very impractical and rather useless too, other than as an ornament, which is why they became a symbol of wealth and status. As time passed, they only grew in size until they went out of favor by the middle of the 17th century. The ruff illustrates very well the importance of clothing as a way to show status. It had no other justification than being decorative. It was very expensive because they quickly lost their shapes and could only be worn once until the discovery of starch that made it possible to reshape them. They had become so extravagant and still useless, a symbol of aristocratic shallowness, that they were banned at the court of Spain in the 17th century by Philip IV. The name Elizabethan collar for these pet cones that are put around the neck of dogs or cats so they can't bite or lick their body comes from these 16th and 17th century ruffs. At the end of the 17th century, fashion followed again a more extravagant direction after a few decades of restraint. Spain and Italy had lost a lot of their influence. Protestant courts had progressively abandoned part of the austerity from the previous period, and now many eyes were looking at the court of Louis XIV that set the tone. This is the moment when aristocratic men started to wear wigs, which lasted until the end of the 18th century. And hoses were replaced with breeches and stockings for men, with a waistcoat and a coat. This way of clothing went through variations, but it also lasted for more than a century. Men's fashion became rather predictable, but women began to wear bigger and bigger dresses, with several layers of clothes underneath, corsets and metallic frameworks to increase volume. This style was not followed in all courts. Spain remained out of step with the fashions that arose in France and maintained the early 17th century style for longer. And so did Holland. At the time, the Netherlands were prosperous, but they had a cultural austerity that made these fashions appear immodest and over the top. A major cultural shift that appeared in the 17th century was also the distinction between men and women's approach to clothing. Men became expected to appear relatively more sober with a simpler outfit and one that didn't hinder their moves. On the opposite, women were now much more colorful with impractical outfits and dresses that were at the same time bigger and more revealing. This continued into the 19th century and to our days, especially in formal wear. If you look at a red carpet event, all men are dressed almost the same, whereas women are expected to be colorful or at least to dress different from one another. So this is the moment when fashion in clothing became more closely identified with one gender, even though there was still fashion for men, but with way slower and subtler changes. And all the industry of cloth making, accessories like jewelry, became more oriented towards women, because they were now the biggest spenders and the category supposedly more interested. Until the 18th century, this was not particularly the case. Men could wear as much jewelry, change outfits, and spend as much as women. By the end of the 18th century, it began a bit before the French Revolution. Fashion evolved towards somewhat simpler lines, as there was a taste in general at the time for the imitation of antiquity. Not only in fashion, this movement, called neoclassical, also touched decorative arts or architecture. There was a brief period in France in the 1790s when clothing became much more sober and less distinctive between social classes, in line with the egalitarian atmosphere of the time. But it didn't last. As soon as the Napoleonic period started, the old and new aristocracy returned to opulent ways of dressing. The 19th century was now beginning, and with it, major changes to society and fashion. First, because until now, all these trends had happened essentially in a tiny group, maybe 1% or less of the population. Lower classes were influenced by royal courts, but there was so much they could afford, and fashion remained a very elitist practice. Clothing for regular people had kept evolving slowly, like in previous centuries. With the Industrial Revolution, the prices of manufactured goods dropped dramatically, including textile, and overall the circle of people wealthy enough to follow fashion became bigger and bigger. The trendsetters also changed. For centuries it had been royal courts and aristocrats, but in the 19th century the new powerful class was the bourgeoisie, that became way wealthier and influent than the majority of old aristocratic families. in some cases, like in the US or in France, the old aristocracy was non-existent or had lost much of its prestige and, as a class, had merged with the high bourgeoisie. 19th century fashion reflects for a large part the values of this new rising class. A good example of this is the Victorian society and fashion in the UK. But a similar system existed in America, in France, or in Germany. Men's fashions became much more sober, even more sober, with mainly dark colors, and the old fashion of breeches and stockings was replaced with trousers. To a large extent, we are still in this today when it comes to formal wear. Suits or tuxedos are the continuation of this way of dressing. The distinction between genders in clothing, and even more than that, the concept of decency, is something that this new class was particularly willing to enforce. This was not something entirely new. Dressing in a way that didn't conform to your gender was a big taboo in the antiquity already, and that continued in Western civilization. One of the charges against Joan of Arc, for example, was that she had dressed like a man. But maybe because there was a perception that these traditional rules could be threatened, the 19th century saw a lot of new laws that put in writing the forbidden transgressions when it came to clothing. For example, women wearing trousers. This was perceived as a challenge to traditional roles, a threat to institutions like families, and in general an insult to good taste and decency. Another point that became a social concern at the end of the 19th century was the practice of sport and dressing on the beach. Going to the beach, to the seaside, had become something the higher classes enjoyed, and with it appeared swimsuits that were initially very covering. For certain periods in the 19th century, it was okay for women to show their shoulders and cleavage, but from the waist down it was absolutely unacceptable. Swimsuits challenged this. They didn't show much skin until the 1920s, but like pants for women, many rules that had dominated sometimes for centuries were beginning to give way in the interwar period. At first among a small circle, until they spread to the rest of society along the 20th century, to the point that a conservative woman in 2020 may dress in a way that would have appeared very scandalous a century ago, with pants and visible ankles, visible knees, and nothing to cover her head. Another trend of the late 19th century is the multiplication of fashion magazines that started to include photos and helped spread fashion well beyond high society. Until the 19th century, cloth making was a very fragmented industry. Clothes were made either at home or by independent dressmakers and seamstresses. By the end of the 19th century, and it exploded in the 20th century, a new figure appeared, the fashion designer, who creates new styles or excels at designing fine clothes. Before that, some fashion creators had a small local fame, But fashion designers and their houses became institutions that could set the tone and influence the way people dress well beyond their client base. That would be a whole other topic, but among them, maybe the most influential in the 20th century, because the types of silhouettes and the styles she proposed still have an influence nowadays, would be Gabrielle Chanel, Coco Chanel, the creator of the brand of the same name. Because it has been changing so much, and also because different styles coexisted, it would be hard to summarize 20th century clothing, but compared to previous centuries, it appears to show more attention paid to comfort, less rigid rules when it comes to women. They can basically use all types of clothes now, and also a much more popular dimension. All classes are now concerned, thanks to the drop in the price of clothes with an industrialized production. Ready-to-wear is also a recent thing. It started about a century ago. And another innovation of the past century is synthetic fibers. They are present in many clothing articles, alone or combined with natural fibers. They are responsible for a decline in the production of some natural fibers like wool or silk, because they quickly became cheaper and have useful specific properties too. The first of these fibers to be commercialized was viscose at the beginning of the 20th century. It is not truly synthetic because it is made of cellulose, of wood, but it is artificial. Truly synthetic fibers made from hydrocarbons mainly appeared from the 1920s to the 1940s. The main ones are nylon, which for various uses could replace silk for a fraction of the cost, for example in military parachutes or ropes, or when it comes to clothing for stockings. Another major discovery is polyester, which is a category of polymers. When turned into fibers, polyesters can be used to produce very cheap clothes. Synthetic fibers have a few advantages apart from the cost. They tend to be more durable and they readily pick up different dyes. They also offer functions that natural fibers don't have. They can stretch much more, or be waterproof or stain resistant. They are not attractive to insects that damage fabrics neither. The cons are that they generally provide a poor insulation because they cannot trap air like wool or even cotton. They are also more prone to heat damage and they can burn or melt quickly. They are generally not very skin friendly. They don't cause allergies like natural fibers can, but they don't let the skin breathe and they don't absorb moisture, so they become sticky when the body sweats. And a bigger concern is for the environment. They shed tiny particles of plastics when they are washed and are a source of microplastics that are not biodegradable and end up in our rivers and our seas. Well, as usual, there would be many more things to tell you, but we will end our story here for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and it gives you the curiosity to investigate some of these topics. For now, you can let go or pick another story from my library if you wish to. Thank you very much for your attention, and sleep well. Au revoir.